Part 1. An Unexpected Delivery. I was 62 when my life turned upside down. Not from illness or loss, but from a faded blue envelope that arrived on a Tuesday morning in April. My husband Richard was out golfing, as he did every Tuesday with his retirement buddies. Our routine had been the same for the 5 years since he'd retired from his dental practice. I'd make his favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with chives from our garden and wheat toast with raspberry jam, then kiss him goodbye as he loaded his clubs into the car. By noon, I'd be halfway through my book club novel, enjoying the quiet of our empty nest. But this Tuesday was different. When the mail carrier pushed that blue envelope through our slot, something inside me stirred. It was addressed to me, Margaret Wilson, in handwriting I hadn't seen in 40 years. Yet, recognized instantly. Impossible, I whispered, my fingers trembling as they traced the elegant script. The return address read James Harrington with a P.O. box in Savannah, Georgia. James. The name alone sent a flush of heat to my cheeks and a flutter to my heart that hadn't been there in decades. James Harrington was my first love, the man I'd planned to marry before life intervened and set me on a different path. The man who disappeared without a trace the summer of 1979. I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope unopened in my hands, as memories washed over me like waves. The scent of salt water and sunscreen, the sound of James's laugh, the feel of his hand in mine as we walked along the beach that last evening together. And the devastating emptiness when he never showed up the next day for our planned elopement. Get a grip, Margaret, I told myself, reaching for the letter opener. It's been 40 years. After all this time, I'd built a good life. Richard was a kind, dependable husband. Our 2 children had grown into successful adults. I had 3 beautiful grandchildren and a comfortable home in Connecticut. I'd buried the heartbreak of my youth so deeply that I rarely thought about it anymore. Yet my hands shook as I slid the opener beneath the envelope's flap, releasing the scent of unfamiliar cologne, not the beachy scent James had worn in our youth. Inside was a single folded page and what appeared to be an old photograph. My dearest Margaret, the letter began, and my world shifted beneath my feet. Part 2. Words from the Past. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then my attorney has followed my instructions. I've thought about writing to you every day for the past 40 years, but cowardice and circumstances kept me silent. Now that I'm facing the end of my journey, I can no longer bear the weight of unspoken truths. I never abandoned you that summer day in 1979. I was there, waiting at our meeting place, watching as you arrived with your small suitcase and looked around with such hope in your eyes. But I wasn't alone. 2 men approached me just before you arrived, men who made it very clear what would happen to you if I went through with our plans. Your father didn't just disapprove of me, Margaret. He was willing to destroy both our lives rather than let his daughter marry someone he considered beneath her. The choice I made that day to walk away without explanation was the hardest of my life. But I believed it was the only way to protect you. I've enclosed a photograph that I've kept all these years, the only one I had of us together. I wanted you to know that what we shared was real, and that not a day has passed when I haven't thought of you and the life we might have had. I'm sorry for the pain I caused. I hope you found happiness. Always yours, James. I stared at the photograph through tears that blurred my vision. There we were, young and beautiful and so obviously in love, standing on the boardwalk at Rockaway Beach, my sundress billowing in the summer breeze, James's arm around my waist, both of us laughing at something forgotten. My father. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My strict, controlling father, who had always insisted he knew what was best for me, who had comforted me through my heartbreak while never once revealing his role in causing it, who had introduced me to Richard 6 months later, deeming him a suitable match for his daughter. The sound of the garage door opening jolted me back to the present. Richard was home early. I quickly folded the letter and slipped it, along with the photograph, back into the envelope. My heart was racing as I tucked it into my book, just as Richard walked through the door. "The guy's canceled," he said, dropping his keys on the counter. Frank's back was acting up again. He paused, studying my face. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile. "Just emotional about my book. You know how I get." Richard nodded, unconvinced, but unwilling to pry. That was our marriage. Comfortable, respectful. But with careful boundaries. We never had the passionate love I'd known with James, but we'd built something stable and enduring. Hadn't we? As I prepared lunch, moving through the familiar motions while my mind raced, a new question formed. Was James still alive? The letter suggested he was ill, perhaps dying when he wrote it. But when was that? The postmark on the envelope was just 3 days old. "I'm thinking of visiting Jennifer next week," I said casually over lunch, referring to our daughter who lived in Boston. She mentioned wanting help with the nursery for the new baby. Richard nodded, focused on his sandwich. "Sounds good. I can manage here." Decision made, I felt a flicker of excitement and fear. I had no intention of going to Boston. Instead, I would go to Savannah to find answers to questions that had suddenly reawakened after 40 years of silence. Part 3. The Journey. 3 days later, I checked into a quaint bed and breakfast in Savannah's historic district. I told Richard I was helping Jennifer, and I told Jennifer I was visiting my old college roommate. The lies made me queasy, but I couldn't explain what I was doing when I barely understood it myself. I'd spent hours online searching for information about James Harrington. There were several in Savannah, but only one whose age matched, a retired architect who had designed several notable buildings in the city. There was little personal information, no mention of a wife or family, just professional accomplishments. The P.O. box from the letter led nowhere. When I'd called the post office, they would only confirm that it was still active, nothing more. On my second morning in Savannah, I found myself sitting in a coffee shop across from a modern glass building that housed Harrington and Associates, architects. According to my research, James had founded the firm in the early 1980s, though he was now retired. His nephew apparently ran it now. "More coffee, ma'am?" the young waitress asked. "Yes, please." I smiled, then took a deep breath. "I'm hoping to get in touch with James Harrington, the architect. Do you happen to know anything about him?" The girl's expression shifted subtly. "Mr. Harrington? Everyone around here knows him. He restored half the historic homes in this district." She hesitated, though I heard he's not doing so well lately. Cancer, they say. My heart constricted. "I'm an old friend," I said softly. "I'd like to see him while I'm in town." "Well, he has that big house on Jones Street. The blue Victorian with white trim. Can't miss it. Don't know if he's there or at the hospital, though." I thanked her, left a generous tip, and found myself walking toward Jones Street with no clear plan. The houses there were magnificent, restored Victorians that spoke of history and old money. And there it was, a stunning blue house with intricate white gingerbread trim and a wide front porch. My courage faltered as I stood at the wrought iron gate. What was I doing? I was a 62-year-old grandmother, married for nearly 4 decades, standing outside the home of a man I'd loved as a girl. This was madness. As I turned to leave, the front door opened. A woman in scrubs stepped out, followed by a tall, elegant woman with silver hair. "I'll be back tomorrow morning at 9, the nurse said. "Call if anything changes overnight." "Thank you, Denise." The silver-haired woman spoke with a gentle southern accent. Before I could retreat, her eyes met mine across the garden. There was a moment of curiosity, then recognition flashed across her face. "Margaret?" she called, stepping toward the gate. "Margaret Wilson?" I froze, confused. I'd never seen this woman before. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" She smiled, a warm, sad smile. "No, but I'd recognize you anywhere from James's description. I'm Elizabeth Harrington, James's wife." Part 4. Unexpected Truths. Elizabeth Harrington invited me into a home that looked like it belonged in a design magazine. Tasteful antiques mixed with modern art, fresh flowers on every surface, and a view of a lush garden through French doors. "James will be so pleased you came," she said, leading me to a sitting room. "He's resting now, but he should wake soon." She studied me with kind eyes. "I suppose you received his letter." "Yes," I admitted, feeling awkward. "I hope my coming here isn't inappropriate." She laughed softly. "My dear, nothing about this situation follows conventional rules of propriety. Please sit. We should talk before you see him." As she poured tea from a silver service, I noticed her hands were steady, her manner composed. How strange to be served tea by the wife of the man I'd once planned to run away with. "James told me about you early in our marriage," Elizabeth began. "He believed in honesty between us. I knew there had been someone he loved deeply, someone he'd had to leave behind." "He said my father threatened him," I said, hearing the lingering hurt in my voice. Elizabeth nodded. "Not just threatened. Your father had connections, influential friends in politics and law enforcement. He made it clear that James would be arrested on fabricated charges if he didn't disappear from your life. Charges that would have ruined him forever." My tea remained untouched as shock washed through me. "That sounds extreme, even for my father." "Your father was protecting more than his social standing, Margaret. He was protecting a secret." She hesitated. "James only learned the full truth years later, through an odd coincidence." She set down her cup. "Your mother had an affair before you were born, with James's uncle, David Harrington. There was a possibility, never confirmed, that you might be David's daughter." "Not your father's." The room seemed to tilt. "What? That's impossible." "Is it?" Elizabeth asked gently. "Did your father ever show you particular strictness or coldness compared to your siblings?" Memories surfaced. My father's constant criticism, his distance, the way he'd scrutinize my features as if looking for something offensive. The different way he treated my younger brother and sister, with easy affection, I'd always envied. But why would he push me toward Richard if he suspected I wasn't his? I asked, struggling to make sense of it all. Richard's family had influence your father needed for his business, and perhaps once you were settled with a suitable husband, the question of your paternity would be permanently buried. Elizabeth's eyes were compassionate. People of your father's generation went to great lengths to avoid scandal. Does James believe this theory? He came to accept it as the most logical explanation for your father's extreme reaction to your relationship. The irony that you might actually be related to the Harringtons, distant cousins perhaps, didn't escape him. A photo on the mantel caught my eye. James and Elizabeth, much younger, with a boy and girl, perhaps 10 and 8. A family, the life he had built after me. "You've had a good life together," I said, not quite a question. "Yes," Elizabeth answered honestly. "Not perfect, but good. We raised 2 wonderful children who've given us 4 grandchildren. We've traveled, built careers, and supported each other through difficulties." She paused. "James loved me, Margaret. I never doubted that, but he never forgot you either." Before I could respond, a door opened down the hallway and a male voice called out, "Lizzie, is someone here?" Elizabeth stood. "That's James. Are you ready?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure. How could anyone be ready for such a moment? She led me down the hallway to a bright sunroom where a man sat in a comfortable chair, a blanket across his legs despite the warm day. His hair was white and thin, his once athletic frame now gaunt, but his eyes, those deep blue eyes that had once looked at me with such love, were unchanged. Those eyes widened as they took me in. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice breaking, "is it really you?" Part 5, Reconciliation. "I'll leave you two to talk," Elizabeth said, touching her husband's shoulder gently before slipping from the room. James and I looked at each other in a silence heavy with decades of unspoken words. He was so changed, the handsome young man now visible only in the structure of his face, the shape of his eyes. Yet somehow, he was still unmistakably James. "You came," he finally said, his voice stronger now. "I wasn't sure you would." I moved to sit in the chair across from him. "I almost didn't. I'm still not sure why I did. For closure, perhaps, or maybe the same curiosity that made me write to you." His smile was tentative. "You look beautiful, Margaret. Life has been good to you?" "Yes," I answered honestly. "I have a good husband, wonderful children, grandchildren I adore. I've been blessed." I paused. "Your wife told me about your family. They sound lovely." "They are." Pride warmed his face. "And Elizabeth, she's extraordinary. I don't deserve her. She seems to think you do." His expression grew serious. "I need you to know I didn't write to you to disrupt your life, or because I have regrets about the path mine took. I wrote because I thought you deserved the truth after all these years." "The truth," I repeated. "Including this theory about my father and your uncle?" James sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I can't prove it. It's what I pieced together from things my uncle let slip near the end of his life, and your father's extreme reaction to us. It made sense of things that had puzzled me for years." "It would explain a lot," I admitted. "The coldness, the criticism, the constant feeling that I was never quite good enough. But it also means my entire life was built on lies." "Not your entire life," James said gently. "Not the family you created, the love you've given and received. That's all real, Margaret." We talked for hours about the lives we'd lived in parallel, his in Savannah, mine in Connecticut, about our children and grandchildren, about the careers we'd built and the places we'd seen. We carefully avoided discussing what might have been, focusing instead on what was. As afternoon turned to evening, I realized I felt lighter than I had in years. Some burden I hadn't known I was carrying had been lifted. "I should go," I finally said, noticing James's increasing fatigue. "But I'm glad I came. Thank you for having the courage to write to me." "Will you come again tomorrow?" he asked, a vulnerability in his question that reminded me of the boy he'd once been. "There's a garden party Elizabeth has been planning for months, a fundraiser for cancer research. I'd like you to come to meet our children." The invitation surprised me. "Are you sure? Won't it be awkward to explain who I am?" He smiled. "Elizabeth already invited you when you were talking in the hallway. She thinks it's a wonderful idea. And as for who you are, you're an old friend I'm delighted to reconnect with. The rest belongs to the past." As Elizabeth showed me out, she pressed a formal invitation into my hand. "Please come. It would mean so much to James." I nodded, touched by her generosity of spirit. "You're an extraordinary woman, Elizabeth." "So are you," she replied with a worn smile. Any woman who could capture James's heart so completely must be. As I walked back to my B&B through the gathering twilight, I called Richard. We'd spoken briefly each evening, maintaining the fiction that I was with Jennifer. "How's the nursery coming along?" he asked after we'd exchanged pleasantries. The lie caught in my throat. 38 years of marriage, built on mutual respect and trust, and here I was, deceiving him. "Richard," I said slowly, "I need to tell you something. I'm not in Boston with Jennifer." There was a pause. "I know." His simple response stunned me. "You know? How?" "Jennifer called yesterday looking for you. She seemed confused when I said you were with her." His voice held no accusation, just curiosity. "Where are you, Margaret?" Standing on a street corner in Savannah, surrounded by historic homes and the scent of jasmine, I told my husband the truth. About James's letter, about my impulsive trip, about the shocking revelations regarding my father, and about the garden party invitation. When I finished, the silence stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Richard?" "I'm here," he said finally, "just processing." "I'm sorry for lying to you," I said, meaning it deeply. "I should have been honest from the start." "Yes, you should have." Another pause. "Do you still love him, this James?" The question deserved careful consideration. "I love the memory of who he was to me once," I answered truthfully. "But that's not the same as loving the man he is now. That man is a stranger to me, one I've just met. The man I've loved for the past 38 years is you." His relief was audible in his sigh. "What happens now?" "I'd like to attend this garden party tomorrow. Then I'll come home and we can talk properly." I hesitated. "Unless you'd rather I come home immediately." "No," Richard said, surprising me. "Go to the party, get the closure you need, then come home to me, and we'll figure out what all this means together." As I ended the call, I felt a profound gratitude for the man I'd married. Not the passionate, overwhelming love I'd felt for James in my youth, but something equally precious, a steady, enduring love built on years of shared experiences, mutual respect, and genuine caring. The next day would bring the garden party and a final goodbye to James Harrington. Then I would return to Connecticut to Richard. And to a life that might need reassessment in light of these revelations about my past. But whatever came next, I would face it with honesty and an open heart. Sometimes it takes a lifetime to understand that love comes in many forms and that each has its own special value. Part 6, The Garden Party. The Harrington home was transformed for the garden party. White tents dotted the expansive backyard, string lights twinkled in the trees, and the air was filled with the sounds of a jazz quartet and elegant conversation. I'd chosen a pale blue dress that flattered my figure without trying too hard. As I approached the entrance, Elizabeth spotted me and came forward with a warm smile. "Margaret, I'm so glad you came." She kissed my cheek as if we were old friends. "James is holding court by the fountain. He's having a good day, more energy than he's had in weeks." She led me through clusters of well-dressed guests to a stone fountain where James sat in a wheelchair, surrounded by what appeared to be family members. He looked better than yesterday, color in his cheeks, his eyes bright with enjoyment. "Look who's here," Elizabeth announced. James looked up, his face lighting with genuine pleasure. "Margaret, you came." He reached for my hand. Everyone, this is Margaret Wilson, my dear friend from New York. Margaret, this is our family. Introductions followed. James and Elizabeth's son Michael, an architect like his father. Their daughter Catherine, a pediatrician. Spouses, grandchildren, and various extended family members. They welcomed me with Southern hospitality, curious but too polite to ask many questions. Dad's told us about his New York days, Michael said as we sipped champagne. Were you part of that scene? I was, I answered carefully. It was a different world back then. He rarely talks about those years, Catherine added. It's nice to meet someone who knew him then. As the evening progressed, I found myself enjoying the gathering more than I'd expected. James's family was delightful, intelligent, warm, and clearly devoted to him. I could see why he was proud of them. Later, as the party was winding down, James asked Michael to wheel him to a quiet corner of the garden where we could talk privately. They're wonderful, I said once we were alone. You've created a beautiful family. Thank you. His smile was contented. Catherine reminds me of you sometimes. Her determination, her compassion. He gazed out at the party. I've been fortunate, Margaret. Despite everything, life has been good to me. To both of us, I agreed. I told Richard the truth, I said after a moment. About being here, about your letter, about all of it. James looked concerned. How did he take it? Better than I deserved, I admitted. He's a good man, not perfect, but good. I'm glad. His sincerity was evident. You deserve happiness, Margaret. Always have. A comfortable silence fell between us. In the distance, Catherine's youngest daughter was twirling in circles, her party dress billowing around her. I have something for you, James said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small box. Open it. Inside was a delicate silver locket. When I pressed the clasp, it opened to reveal a tiny scrap of paper with faded writing. Forever, J. You kept it, I whispered, recognizing the note I'd tucked into his pocket the day before he was supposed to meet me for our elopement. All these years. It reminded me that true love exists, even when circumstances make it impossible. He closed my fingers around the locket. I want you to have it back, not as a romantic gesture, but as proof that what we shared was real. Tears threatened, but I blinked them away. Thank you. Will you write to me? He asked. Now that we've found each other again, I'd like to keep in touch for whatever time I have left. I'd like that too. Elizabeth appeared, discreetly signaling that James needed to rest. As she wheeled him toward the house, he turned back to me. Be happy, Margaret. That's all I ever wanted for you. I watched them go, feeling not sadness, but a profound sense of peace. The past had finally been laid to rest. The next morning, as my plane took off from Savannah, I looked down at the beautiful city growing smaller beneath me. Part of my heart would always belong to the young man I'd loved there, but the larger part was already reaching toward Connecticut, toward Richard and the life we'd built together. I touched the silver locket in my pocket. Some loves remain forever in our hearts, shaping who we become. But it's the love we choose every day, through difficulties and joys, through mundane moments and milestone events, that defines our lives. As the plane rose into the clouds, I opened my notebook and began a letter to Richard, telling him how much I loved him and how eager I was to come home.